Alright, settle in folks, because tonight we're not spinning yarns about knights in shining armor or damsels in distress. We're going to unearth the surprisingly sophisticated and often quite seedy world of medieval espionage. I know, medieval probably conjures up images of jousting tournaments and overflowing goblets of wine, not clandestine meetings and whispered secrets. But trust me, beneath the surface of those seemingly simple times, a complex web of intrigue was being spun, thread by careful thread. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Now, the first thing we need to do is chuck a few misconceptions right out the window. Forget everything you've seen in movies. We're not talking about James Bond with a broadsword, okay? No fancy gadgets. No exploding quills though, wouldn't that be something? Medieval spies weren't dashing heroes saving the kingdom with a wink and a well-placed punch. The reality was far more grounded. Think less action-adventure, more careful observation and calculated risk. One of the biggest myths is that the Middle Ages were, well, dumb, that everyone was illiterate and easily fooled. That's simply not true. While literacy rates weren't what they are today, there were plenty of educated people around, clergy, scholars, merchants, even some nobles. And where there's education, there's the ability to read, write, and crucially think critically. So any good spy needed to be just as clever, if not more so, than those they were trying to deceive. Another misconception is that spying was somehow beneath people, that it was a dishonorable profession only for the desperate or the villainous. While there was certainly a stigma attached to it, more on that later, the truth is that espionage was seen as a necessary evil by many rulers and institutions. Think of it like this: in a world where information was power, spying was simply another tool in the arsenal, like a well-forged sword or a sturdy castle wall. Kings, queens, even the Pope employed spies. They may not have liked doing it, but they recognized its value. So what kind of world are we talking about here? Imagine a Europe fractured into countless kingdoms, duchies, and city-states, all vying for power and influence. Think of a constant game of chess, but with real lives and territories at stake. Alliances shifted constantly. Betrayals were commonplace, and wars were frequent, often sparked by nothing more than a perceived slight or a land dispute. In this environment, knowing what your neighbors were up to was absolutely essential. Were they building up their armies? Were they plotting an alliance against you? Were they about to launch a surprise attack? Without reliable information, you were basically flying blind, and that's where spies came in. They were the eyes and ears of their masters, providing crucial intelligence that could make the difference between victory and defeat, survival and annihilation. They operated in the shadows, gathering information, spreading rumors, and manipulating events from behind the scenes. Now, before we dive deeper into the methods and motivations of these medieval agents, it's important to understand one key thing: the medieval mindset. Their worldview, their values, and their beliefs shaped everything, including how they viewed espionage. What was considered acceptable? What was off-limits? What were the potential consequences if you were caught? The Middle Ages were a deeply religious time. The church held immense power, both spiritual and political. And while the church preached against lying and deception, even they weren't above using spies to protect their interests. This created a fascinating tension between morality and practicality, a tension that would define the world of medieval espionage. We also have to acknowledge the social hierarchy. Medieval society was rigidly structured, with clear lines of authority and obligation. This meant that spies often had to navigate complex social dynamics, using their understanding of class and status to their advantage. A well-placed word in the ear of a disgruntled nobleman could be far more valuable than any amount of military intelligence. Finally, remember that this was a world without modern technology. No telephones, no computers, no internet. Information traveled slowly, by word of mouth, by messenger, or by ship. This meant that spies had to be resourceful and inventive, relying on their wits and their ability to blend in to gather and transmit information. So, with those myths debunked and the stage set, we're ready to journey into the hidden world of medieval spies. We'll explore their motivations, their methods, and their impact on the course of history. Get ready to uncover the secrets, the betrayals, and the surprising sophistication of espionage in the Middle Ages. It's going to be a fascinating ride, I promise you. Alright, settle in, friends. Let's gently ease into understanding why spying was such a necessary, if often rather shady, part of medieval life. Now, we're not talking James Bond levels of gadgetry and globe-trotting here, okay? This was the Middle Ages. Think more along the lines of whispered secrets in drafty castles and muddy roads hiding a lot of, well, intrigue. To really grasp it, we've got to try and slip into a medieval brain for a little bit. And trust me, it's a very different space than our modern minds. For starters, imagine a world where information moves at the speed of a horse or a ship. That's it. No internet, no instant news, no fact-checking at your fingertips. Rumors were basically currency, and truth, well, truth was often whatever the most powerful person said it was. Power dynamics were unbelievably rigid. You were born into a certain social class, and chances were you stayed there. And your loyalty, it belonged to your lord, your king, your church, in that order, or maybe not. This web of feudal obligations and loyalties was incredibly complex and always shifting. One minute you were sworn to protect your liege lord, the next, well, you were plotting to overthrow him because he was plotting to overthrow his liege lord. It got messy. Also, let's not forget the religious aspect. The church held immense power, both spiritual and political, and they weren't shy about wielding it. Heresy was a major crime, and accusing someone of heresy, well, that was a very effective way to get rid of an enemy. So, keeping an eye on what your neighbors believed, and more importantly, said they believed, became a matter of survival for you and your family. And then there's the constant threat of war. We tend to think of knights in shining armor and grand battles, but medieval warfare was often a messy, brutal affair of sieges, raids, and shifting alliances. Knowing your enemy's troop strength, their plans, their weaknesses, that could be the difference between victory and utter annihilation. This wasn't a gentleman's game, and that meant spying was as valid a tactic as any, and was often preferred to open battle. So in this world of shifting loyalties, religious fervor, and constant warfare, information became the most valuable commodity. And that's where spies came in. They were the people who could get you that information, by hook or by crook. But here's the thing, spying wasn't exactly considered an honorable profession. In fact, it was generally seen as pretty darn dishonorable. Think about it. You're asking someone to betray trust, to lie, to deceive, all for your benefit. That doesn't exactly scream moral high ground, does it? Medieval society placed a huge emphasis on honor, oaths, and loyalty. So a spy was inherently breaking those codes. They were essentially double-crossing everyone they interacted with. They were perceived to be, and often were, untrustworthy. This creates an interesting dilemma. Spying was absolutely necessary for survival, but it was also morally repugnant to many. So how did people reconcile that? Well, that's where the justifications came in. For rulers, it was all about the good of the realm. They argued that lying, deception, even betrayal were justifiable if it protected their people from harm. The ends justify the means, as they say. Survival, in their view, was the ultimate trump card, and any means necessary to ensure that survival was, well, necessary. The The church also had its own justifications. Spies could be used to root out heresy, to protect the faithful from false teachings, or to uncover plots against the church. And in the eyes of the church, defending the faith was a sacred duty, justifying pretty much anything. And for the spies themselves, well, sometimes it was about loyalty to their lord, a sense of duty. Other times it was about money, plain and simple. Let's be honest, spying wasn't exactly a career path that attracted the nobility. It was often a job for the lower classes, people who needed to make a living and who were willing to do what it took. Moral qualms be damned. Survival for their family was a very strong motivator indeed. But whatever the justifications, the stigma remained. Spies were often seen as social pariahs, people you couldn't trust, people who operated in the shadows. They were necessary evils, tolerated but never really respected. Their actions were often seen as a blight. And that, my friends, is the fascinating paradox of medieval espionage. It was absolutely essential for power, survival, and even religious conviction. Yet it was also deeply dishonorable. A dirty business that no one really wanted to admit they were involved in. It was this complex interplay of necessity and moral ambiguity that shaped the world of medieval spies. They were the unsung, often reviled, heroes or villains of their time. And their stories, well, they're far more interesting than any fairy tale. You know, so sleep on that. Think about how different that world was, how those complex values influenced their lives. And in our next segment, we will delve into the royal court to discover spying at the highest levels. Get cozy. All right, settle in, because we're about to peek behind the velvet curtains and into the world of royal espionage. Think less damsels in distress and more devious dukes and scheming sovereigns. Because let's be honest, being a king or queen in the Middle Ages was basically a full-time job of trying not to get murdered by your relatives, and a little bit more. So, how did these monarchs maintain power? Well, armies of course, but also a surprisingly robust network of spies. You might think of knights and castles when you picture medieval royalty, but there was an entire underworld of secret agents working on their behalf, gathering intelligence, and sometimes just eliminating problems. Now, before we go any further, let's dispel a common misconception. Royal spying wasn't all about James Bond-esque figures scaling castle walls in the dead of night. While those operatives existed, the real powerhouses of royal espionage were often people already inside the royal court. Think trusted advisors, ladies-in-waiting, even members of the royal family themselves. Why? Because proximity is power. Who better to glean secrets than someone who's always in the room when decisions are made? These courtly spies, as we might call them, were masters of observation, gossip, and manipulation. They knew how to listen, how to ask the right questions, and how to use information to their advantage, and to their monarch's advantage, of course. Consider the role of women, for example. Often overlooked in traditional historical accounts, women held significant influence within royal courts. They were confidants to the queen, companions to princesses, and often the only people who could get close enough to the king to whisper in his ear, literally. This access made them incredibly valuable sources of information. But it wasn't just about gossip. Courtly spies often had formal responsibilities that allowed them to gather intelligence under the guise of legitimate business. A royal ambassador, for example, might be tasked with negotiating a treaty, but they were also expected to assess the strength of the opposing kingdom's army, the loyalty of its nobles, and the king's general state of mind. Diplomacy, in the Middle Ages, was just espionage with a fancy hat. And speaking of hats, clothing played a key role in the information game. Embroidered symbols could signal alliances or betrayals. A specific color might indicate a secret allegiance. And of course, hidden pockets and compartments were perfect for carrying coded messages or, a vial of poison. But gathering information was only half the battle. The real challenge was getting that information back to the king or queen without it falling into the wrong hands. Messengers were often disguised as merchants or traveling minstrels. Messages were written in code using complex ciphers and symbols, and sometimes the message was the minstrel, a song with hidden meanings, a poem with double entendre, or a seemingly harmless riddle that contained vital information. Then, of course, there were the more direct methods. Think of a seemingly innocent gift sent to a rival court. A beautiful tapestry might contain a hidden map of the kingdom's defenses. A jeweled goblet might be laced with slow-acting poison. The possibilities were endless and often quite gruesome. But let's not forget the risks. Being a royal spy was a dangerous game. If caught, the consequences could be severe: imprisonment, torture, or a swift execution. And even if you weren't caught, the constant stress of living a double life could take a toll on your mental and emotional health. So what kind of information were these royal spies gathering? Well, everything that could give their monarch an edge. They wanted to know about the strengths and weaknesses of rival kingdoms, the loyalties of their own nobles, and any potential threats to the throne. Think about it. Who was plotting against the king? What alliances were being forged in secret? What resources did the enemy have? The answer to these questions could mean the difference between a long and prosperous reign and a sudden violent end. Royal spies also played a crucial role in shaping public opinion. They spread rumors, planted false stories, and manipulated events to sway the population in favor of the king or queen. Propaganda, in other words, was alive and well in the Middle Ages, and sometimes the best way to control the narrative was to eliminate the competition. Royal spies were often tasked with assassinating political opponents, silencing dissenters, and generally making life difficult for anyone who posed a threat to the crown. So the next time you imagine medieval royalty, remember that behind all the pageantry and power, there was a hidden world of espionage, intrigue, and betrayal. A world where secrets were currency and spies were the ultimate power brokers. Because in the Middle Ages, knowing what your enemies were planning was often the only thing that stood between you and the executioner's block. And now, sleep well, knowing you're safe under your blankets and away from the royal courts of old. Alright, settle in a little deeper, because we're about to uncover something really fascinating. You might not immediately think of espionage when you picture monks in monasteries or bishops in their cathedrals. But trust me, the medieval church, for all its spiritual pronouncements, was just as involved in the murky world of spying as any king or queen. We're talking about the church's secret service, espionage within the holy orders. Now, to understand why the church needed its own network of spies, you have to remember the immense power it wielded in the Middle Ages. We're not just talking about spiritual influence, although that was considerable. Think of the church as a kind of medieval superpower. They owned vast tracts of land, controlled education and intellectual life, and could even make or break monarchs with the threat of excommunication. All that power, well, it made the church a prime target for intrigue. Popes, bishops, and abbots weren't just concerned with souls, they were also concerned with protecting their earthly interests and expanding their influence. Information was key to this, and that's where espionage came in. So how did the church actually go about spying? Well, they had a unique advantage, a vast international network of personnel. Think about it. Monasteries and convents dotted the landscape across Europe, all connected by a common faith, and more importantly, by hierarchical chains of command that stretched all the way to Rome. This provided an incredible infrastructure for gathering and transmitting intelligence. Monks, often literate and well-traveled, could act as incredibly discreet informants. They could overhear conversations in taverns, observe the movements of armies, and even subtly influence local opinions. Let's say a particular nobleman was becoming a little too powerful for the church's liking. A strategically placed monk might discover evidence of heresy, or subtly undermine his authority with whispered doubts. Convents too played a role. Nuns, particularly those from noble families, often maintained connections with the outside world. They could provide valuable insights into the political maneuverings of their relatives, or discreetly pass messages between different factions. Imagine a noblewoman, taking the veil not out of piety but under the direction of the Pope, her true purpose to be the ear and the eye. But the church's espionage wasn't limited to the rank and file. High-ranking clergy, even cardinals and bishops, were often deeply involved in gathering intelligence. These individuals had access to the highest levels of power, both within the church and in secular governments. A bishop, say, serving as a royal advisor, could subtly steer the king's policies in the church's favor, or warn Rome of potential threats. Sometimes the church's spying activities were quite blatant. Papal legates, envoys sent to represent the Pope in different regions, were often tasked with gathering information, as well as conducting diplomacy. These legates weren't just spiritual leaders, they were also skilled negotiators, political observers, and yes, spies. Think of them as James Bond in a cassock. And of course, no discussion of medieval espionage would be complete without mentioning the use of spies against the church. Kings and emperors, constantly vying for power with the Pope, often planted their own agents within the church hierarchy. These agents could report on the Pope's plans, uncover evidence of corruption, or even attempt to undermine his authority from within. This created a fascinating and often dangerous game of cat and mouse. The church spying on secular rulers spying on the church, and all played out against the backdrop of religious fervor. Betrayal, double-dealing, and the ever-present threat of excommunication, or even worse, accusations of heresy. But what kind of information were these spies gathering? Well, pretty much anything that could be used to the church's advantage. Military intelligence was crucial. Knowing the strength and movements of armies could help the church protect its lands and influence the outcome of conflicts. Think of monasteries on trade routes strategically placed, almost as if waypoints, but with intelligence gathering as the real purpose. Financial intelligence was also vital. The church needed to keep track of its vast wealth and ensure that it wasn't being defrauded. Spies could uncover embezzlement, track down lost revenue, or even identify wealthy individuals ripe for persuasion, shall we say, when it came to bequeathing their fortunes to the church. Political intelligence was perhaps the most important of all. Knowing the alliances and rivalries between different rulers allowed the church to play them off against each other, maximizing its own power and influence. A well-placed spy could uncover secret treaties, expose conspiracies, or even assassinate a troublesome opponent. Yes, even the church sometimes resorted to assassination, though it was usually carried out through proxies, of course. The Knights Templar, though ostensibly a military order, also played a significant role in the church's intelligence network. They had extensive financial resources and a presence throughout Europe and the Middle East, which made them ideally suited for gathering information. Their network of treasuries and commanderies served not just as banking centers, but as listening posts and communication hubs. Furthermore, the church's network of spies wasn't just limited to Europe. Missionaries, sent to spread the faith to distant lands, often acted as intelligence gatherers as well. They could report on the customs, resources, and political structures of foreign cultures, paving the way for future trade or even conquest. Think of the early missionaries to the Far East as the ultimate undercover agents, blending into the culture, learning the language, and reporting back to Rome. So, the next time you picture a medieval monk, don't just imagine him quietly copying manuscripts. Picture him as a secret agent, gathering intelligence, manipulating events, and protecting the interests of the most powerful institution in the Middle Ages. Because behind that pious facade, there was a world of intrigue, espionage, and power politics, all conducted in the name of God. And that, my friends, is a truly fascinating slice of history. Sweet dreams. Alright, settle in, friends. Let's gently drift into the world of medieval merchant networks, where silks and spices weren't the only things being traded. Think of it like a massive, sprawling global marketplace, only instead of Amazon, it's donkeys, boats, and the occasional very disgruntled camel. These networks, stretching from the bustling ports of the Mediterranean to the frosty trading posts of the Baltic Sea, and even snaking their way along the Silk Road, were more than just economic arteries. They were information superhighways. Dial-up, maybe, but superhighways nonetheless. Imagine you're a merchant, say, in Venice. You're dealing in everything from luxurious textiles to precious metals. But to really thrive, you need an edge. You need to know what the demand is like in Bruges, or what kind of taxes the King of France is planning to levy on your goods. This is where the hidden world part comes in. Merchants became masters of gathering intelligence. Their ships, carts, and pack animals weren't just carrying cargo. They were carrying carefully crafted letters, whispered rumors, and coded messages. Think of them as medieval James Bonds. Okay, maybe not quite as suave or action-packed, but definitely with a similar dedication to gathering intel. They'd cultivate relationships with port officials, innkeepers, and even rival merchants. A seemingly innocent conversation over a glass of wine could reveal valuable information about competitors' plans, political instability in a region, or even the movements of enemy fleets. A friendly gesture, a small gift, a whispered secret, all these things were payment for info. Consider the powerful Hanseatic League, a trading alliance of merchant guilds that dominated trade in Northern Europe for centuries. They weren't just moving goods, they were essentially running their own intelligence agency. They had agents stationed in key cities, gathering information on everything from grain prices to political alliances. This information gave them a significant advantage, allowing them to control trade routes, negotiate favorable treaties, and even wage wars when necessary. Now you might be thinking, how reliable was this information? Well, that's the tricky part. Accuracy was definitely not guaranteed. Rumors could be easily spread, and misinformation was a constant threat. Verification was a slow and painstaking process. You couldn't just Google it, you know. A merchant might send multiple agents to the same location, each tasked with gathering the same information. By comparing their reports, he could get a better sense of what was actually happening. They would also look for corroborating evidence, such as official documents or independent accounts. All this cost money, time, and resources. And let's not forget about the dangers. Spying was not exactly a respected profession. If a merchant was caught gathering information for a rival power or engaging in subversive activities, the consequences could be severe. Imprisonment, torture, or even execution were all very real possibilities. This risk meant that merchants had to be incredibly careful about who they trusted. They would often rely on family members, close friends, or trusted employees to carry out their intelligence gathering operations. These individuals were carefully vetted and sworn to secrecy. The price of disloyalty was more than just the loss of a job, it was potentially a death sentence. One clever tactic merchants used was to disguise their intelligence gathering activities as legitimate business dealings. A merchant might travel to a foreign city under the guise of purchasing goods, but in reality, he was there to gather information about the local political situation. Another tactic was to use coded messages to communicate sensitive information. These codes could be as simple as substituting letters or numbers, or as complex as using elaborate ciphers. The key was to ensure that only the intended recipient could decipher the message. Sometimes they used special inks. The flow of information wasn't just about economic gain, it was also about survival. In a world of constant warfare and political intrigue, knowing what your enemies were planning was essential for protecting your assets and your life. Medieval trade fairs, like those held in Champagne, France, were also hotbeds of espionage. Merchants from all over Europe would gather to buy and sell goods, but they would also exchange information, rumors, and gossip. These fairs were like giant networking events for spies. The information gathered by merchants could have a significant impact on political events. For example, a merchant might learn about a plot to overthrow a king and warn the ruler in time to prevent it. Or a merchant might discover that a rival kingdom is planning to invade and alert his own government. The relationship between merchants and governments was often complex. On the one hand, governments relied on merchants for trade and revenue. On the other hand, they were wary of their power and influence. Some governments even employed merchants as spies, using their networks to gather information about foreign powers. In return, the merchants would receive protection, preferential treatment, and access to valuable resources. It was often a mutually beneficial, if somewhat uneasy, alliance. So, the next time you enjoy a delicious spice or admire a beautiful piece of fabric, remember that it might have been transported along a trade route that was also carrying secrets, whispers, and the ever-present threat of betrayal. These merchants, these silent spies, were shaping the medieval world in ways that history books often overlook. And with that, we'll gently move on to our next topic, maybe something a little more stabby. Alright, settle in folks. Let's drift into a slightly darker corner of our medieval world tonight, the world of assassins and their masters. It's a world where shadows held more power than sunlight, and a whispered promise could be a death sentence. Now, we've touched on spies gathering information, right? But what happens when information isn't enough? What happens when someone needs to disappear? That's where assassins came in. And let's be clear, this wasn't just some random back-alley knifing. This was often calculated, politically motivated, and meticulously planned. Think of it as another tool in the medieval ruler's toolbox. Diplomacy failing, enemy king causing too much trouble. A well-placed assassin could solve problems that armies couldn't. Now, of course, nobody officially sanctioned these acts. It was all very deniable, very hush-hush. Kings and nobles preferred to maintain a veneer of respectability, even while employing some truly unscrupulous methods. Oh, that guy. Terrible accident. So sad, you get the picture. So who were these masters of death? Well, they came from all walks of life. Some were disgraced knights, perhaps fallen on hard times and looking for a way to use their martial skills. Others might have been apothecaries, skilled in the art of poisons and concoctions. Some were simply ruthless individuals, driven by greed or a thirst for power. And remember, medieval society wasn't exactly known for its robust social safety net. For some, assassination was simply a job, a means to survive in a brutal world. One thing that often gets overlooked is the level of skill involved. We're not talking about clumsy stabbings here. These were professionals. They needed to be stealthy, observant, and resourceful. Disguises were crucial. The ability to blend in, to move unnoticed, was often the difference between success and a gruesome execution. Consider the challenges. No CCTV cameras, no fingerprint databases, no DNA analysis, just word of mouth, rumors, and the occasional sketch. An assassin's best weapon was their anonymity. They had to be ghosts, fading into the background after their deed was done. Poisons were a popular choice, naturally. A slow-acting poison could be administered weeks before the target finally succumbed, making it incredibly difficult to trace back to the assassin. Imagine the knowledge required. Understanding which plants contained deadly toxins, how to administer them effectively, and how to mask the taste. It was a dark art for sure. And then there were the methods that bordered on the theatrical. We're talking about elaborately staged accidents, manipulated events, and sometimes outright displays of brutal force. Think about someone wanting to send a message. A king publicly assassinated during a religious ceremony, for example. The act itself might be less about eliminating the target and more about instilling fear in their enemies and sending a clear signal, don't mess with us. Of course, this world wasn't without its famous examples. The Hashashin, or assassins, a Nizari Ismaili sect active primarily in Persia and Syria, often get name-dropped when talking about this topic. Their reputation for eliminating key political and military figures spread far and wide, fueled by both fact and legend. Stories circulated of their unwavering loyalty, their mastery of disguise, and their willingness to sacrifice themselves for their cause. Whether these stories were entirely true or not, they certainly made the Hashashin a force to be reckoned with. But let's not solely focus on the East. Europe had its share of skilled assassins too. Royal courts were rife with intrigue, and whispers of poisonings and suspicious deaths were commonplace. Think of the Borgias in Renaissance Italy, for example. While not strictly medieval, their ruthlessness and willingness to employ any means necessary offer a glimpse into the kind of Machiavellian mindset that could lead to assassination. One particularly fascinating aspect is the ethical dilemma. How did people reconcile the act of assassination with their own moral code? Well, that depended on who you asked. Some undoubtedly saw it as a necessary evil, a way to protect their kingdom or their people. Others might have justified it through religious or political ideology. And some, let's be honest, probably didn't give it a second thought. They were simply following orders, doing their job. The consequences of failure, however, were severe. Capture meant torture, a gruesome public execution, and potentially the exposure of their employers. The stakes were incredibly high, which only added to the allure and danger of the assassin's life. So the next time you're reading a medieval story or watching a historical drama, think about the shadows lurking just out of sight. Think about the silent figures moving through the night, their motives hidden, their skills honed to a deadly edge. The world of assassins and their masters was a dark and dangerous place, a reflection of the brutal realities of medieval power politics. And while we might find it morally reprehensible, it's a fascinating glimpse into the darker side of human nature, a side that unfortunately has been present throughout history. Now, let's just gently drift onto something a little lighter, shall we? Perhaps some calming codes and ciphers. Just let that all sink in. Alright, settle in, friends. Let's whisper about a topic that's surprisingly fascinating. How people kept secrets in the Middle Ages, a time before computers, encryption software, or even reliable postal services. We're going to delve into the surprisingly sophisticated world of medieval codes and ciphers. Think of it as information security, but done with quills and parchment. Now, why were codes and ciphers even necessary? Well, as we've discussed, the medieval world was a dangerous and often duplicitous place. Kingdoms plotted against each other, nobles schemed for power, and even the church had its secrets to guard. Sending a message in plain language was like shouting your intentions from the rooftops. It was an invitation for enemies to intercept, read, and potentially use your words against you. Imagine crafting the perfect plan to usurp a kingdom, only for a bored guard to read it aloud during his lunch break. Mortifying. So how did they do it? Let's start with the basics. A code is where words or phrases are replaced with other words, symbols, or numbers. Think of it like a secret dictionary. You and your intended recipient both have a copy, and you use it to translate your message. A cipher, on the other hand, works at the level of individual letters. It involves scrambling or substituting letters according to a specific rule or algorithm. Codes were often used for more sensitive or high-level communications. Imagine a codebook listing common phrases like "attack at dawn," "the king is ill," or "send reinforcements." These would be replaced with seemingly innocuous words or numbers, making the message appear harmless to anyone who intercepted it. The beauty of a code is its simplicity and, at least initially, its security. The downside: codebooks could be captured or stolen. If your enemy got their hands on your codebook, all your secrets were laid bare. Plus, these codebooks could become rather extensive and unwieldy. Ciphers, therefore, offered a more flexible and, in some ways, more secure approach. One of the simplest and most commonly used ciphers was the Caesar cipher, named after Julius Caesar, who supposedly used it to communicate with his generals. The Caesar cipher is a substitution cipher, where each letter in the original message is shifted a certain number of positions down the alphabet. So, for example, with a shift of 3, A becomes D, B becomes E, and so on. To decrypt the message, the recipient simply shifts each letter back by the same amount. It's remarkably simple, and while it wouldn't fool a modern cryptographer for a second, it was surprisingly effective in a time when literacy was low and knowledge of cryptography was even lower. Another relatively simple cipher was the monoalphabetic substitution cipher, where each letter of the alphabet is consistently replaced with a different letter or symbol. Unlike the Caesar cipher, the substitution is not based on a simple shift, but on a pre-arranged key. This makes it a bit harder to break than the Caesar cipher, but it still has a major weakness: frequency analysis. In any language, some letters occur more frequently than others. In English, for example, E is the most common letter. By analyzing the frequency of letters in the encrypted message, a clever codebreaker could start to deduce which letters correspond to which. To overcome the limitations of monoalphabetic ciphers, medieval cryptographers developed more sophisticated techniques. One important advancement was the polyalphabetic cipher, which uses multiple substitution alphabets. The most famous example is the Vigenère cipher, developed in the 16th century, though based on earlier ideas. In the Vigenère cipher, a keyword is used to determine which alphabet to use for each letter of the message. For example, if the keyword is lemon, the first letter of the message would be encrypted using the Caesar cipher with a shift corresponding to le, the second letter with a shift corresponding to E, the third with a shift corresponding to E, and so on. Once the keyword is exhausted, it's repeated. This makes frequency analysis much more difficult, as the same letter in the original message might be encrypted differently each time. The Vigenère cipher was considered unbreakable for centuries and was even known as le chiffre indéchiffrable, the indecipherable cipher. And it wasn't just about shifting letters around. Sometimes numbers played a key role. Certain numbers could be assigned to certain letters or even words and phrases. This often allowed for a message to look like a mathematical equation on the surface to an outsider, all while explaining your need for extra horses to invade a neighboring territory. But encryption was only half the battle. You could have the most unbreakable cipher in the world, but it's useless if your message is intercepted and its very existence screamed from the rooftops. Medieval spies and messengers employed various techniques to conceal their messages. One popular method was steganography, which involves hiding the message within something else. This could be as simple as writing in invisible ink made from lemon juice or milk, which would only appear when heated, or a message could be written in tiny letters on a piece of parchment that was then rolled up and hidden inside a wax seal. Some spies even used microdots, tiny photographs of documents that could be hidden under a postage stamp or even in a speck of dirt. Another clever technique was to use a null cipher, where the message is hidden within an innocent-looking text. For example, the real message might be formed by taking every fifth word, or by looking at the first letter of each sentence. So a seemingly harmless letter about sheep farming could actually contain instructions for a secret rendezvous. Think of it like a word puzzle that only the intended recipient knows how to solve. Even the way a message was delivered could be used to conceal its true meaning. Messengers might be disguised as merchants or pilgrims, or they might take roundabout routes to avoid suspicion. They might memorize the message and destroy the written copy, relying on their memory to deliver it to the intended recipient. This, of course, was risky, as messengers could be captured, tortured, or simply forget the message along the way. However, it was often considered a necessary precaution, so next time you hear about a historical character sending a secret message, remember all the clever methods they might have used to protect it. From simple letter shifts to complicated numerical patterns, they found ways to secure secrets without technology. I find it all incredibly fascinating, don't you? And well, good night. All right. Settle in, let's get cozy and drift away to the world of disguises. Yes, disguises. Now you might think of costumes and capes and all that swashbuckling silliness, but for our medieval spies it was a little more nuanced, a little more, well, practical. Think less Zorro, more, well, a really dedicated method actor on a budget. The core of any good disguise then as now is simple. It's about controlling perception. You're not just slapping on a fake mustache, you're crafting an entire believable persona. And the beauty of the medieval world for our sneaky friends was that society was so rigidly structured, everyone already had a predefined box. All you had to do was step into the right one. The easiest route, naturally, was to mimic the common folk. A humble peasant's garb, rough spun tunic, simple trousers, perhaps a floppy hat to obscure the face, could get you pretty far. After all, who pays attention to a peasant? They were, quite literally, part of the background. The trick, of course, was to act the part. That meant mastering the regional dialect, knowing the local gossip, who's feuding with whom, whose cow just calved, that kind of thing, and possessing the appropriate level of, shall we say, deference. Remember, in a hierarchical society, knowing your place was crucial. A peasant who acted too knowledgeable or too confident would raise suspicion faster than you can say witchcraft. Another popular option, and one that offered more mobility, was the guise of a traveling merchant. These folks were a common sight on medieval roads, peddling everything from spices and silks to, well, let's just say less than legit goods. The advantage here was that merchants were expected to travel, to interact with different social classes, and to possess a certain amount of charming persuasiveness. A decent set of clothes, though not too fancy, you don't want to look like you're trying too hard, a sturdy cart or pack, and a plausible backstory could get you access to all sorts of interesting places. Plus, being a merchant provided a perfect cover for gathering information. Oh, I'm just curious about market prices, you might say, while discreetly eavesdropping on a conversation about troop movements. Purely business, you understand. Now, things got a little more complicated if your spy needed to infiltrate the upper echelons of society. Pretending to be a knight, for instance, was a risky proposition. Knights were expected to be skilled warriors, accomplished horsemen, and well-versed in courtly etiquette. Faking all that would be challenging, to say the least. But it wasn't impossible. A clever spy might pose as a lesser noble, perhaps one from a distant land, giving them an excuse for any eccentricities. A meticulously crafted family history, complete with fabricated crests and seals, would be essential, as would a thorough understanding of heraldry. The key, as always, was attention to detail. One slip-up, one misplaced fleur-de-lis, and your entire carefully constructed facade could crumble. Interestingly, one of the best disguises for getting close to power was sometimes no disguise at all. Paradoxical, isn't it? What I mean is, a spy operating within the court might choose simply to be themselves, or rather, a highly cultivated, strategically deployed version of themselves. Think of it as professional friend-making. They'd cultivate relationships with key figures, becoming trusted confidantes, sharing carefully curated secrets, and generally making themselves indispensable. This approach required patience, charm, and an ability to listen far more than you talk. The goal was to become so embedded in the social fabric of the court that no one would ever suspect you of being anything other than a loyal, friend. After all, who suspects a friend of espionage? Now, let's talk about standing out a little bit. Sometimes the most effective method of hiding in plain sight is being so unusual that nobody suspects you're actually trying to hide. Think of the wandering scholar, a bit disheveled, carrying a stack of books, always muttering to themselves. Who's going to notice them slipping into the library at night? The wandering minstrel, too, was a great way to get into and around castles. Entertainment, my lord. You might be playing the lute, but you are taking a very keen note of guard changes. And then, of course, there's the crazy disguise. Now, this wasn't just about acting goofy. It was about cultivating a persona so utterly unpredictable and eccentric that people would dismiss you as harmless, even when you were doing something suspicious. Medieval courts often had jesters or fools, whose job it was to entertain the royal family and their guests. These individuals were often given a remarkable amount of leeway, allowed to say things that others wouldn't dare. A clever spy could use this freedom to their advantage, gathering information under the guise of, well, just being a fool. After all, who takes a fool seriously? But it wasn't always about deception in the traditional sense. Sometimes the disguise was simply about exaggeration, overplaying a characteristic to the point of caricature. For instance, a spy trying to gather information about a religious order might feign extreme piety, attending every service, donating generously, and generally making a show of their devotion. This would draw attention, yes, but it would also make them appear harmless. Look at that poor soul, people might say, so eager to please God. Little would they know that their overly pious friend was actually gathering intel on the monastery's secret wine cellar. Or something more important, but you get the picture. Crucially, whatever disguise was chosen, maintaining it required constant vigilance. One slip of the tongue, one anachronistic gesture, one wrong inflection, and the game was up. The medieval world was a suspicious place, and the consequences of being unmasked as a spy could be rather unpleasant. Think dungeons, torture, and a very public execution. So next time you reach for that Halloween costume, remember the medieval spy, meticulously crafting their persona, carefully controlling perception, and always watching their back. Because in their world, a good disguise wasn't just about looking different, it was about staying alive. And hopefully, my friend, this information will let you sleep better tonight. Alright, settle in, let's talk about how they really got information in the Middle Ages. Forget gentle persuasion, friends. We're about to delve into interrogation techniques, and well, they weren't exactly offering tea and biscuits. Information, especially in a world without instant communication, was power. Knowing what your enemy, or even your supposed ally, was planning could be the difference between victory and utter ruin. So extracting that knowledge, it was a top priority, and the methods reflected the often brutal realities of the time. Now, it's important to remember, interrogation wasn't always a formalized, legal process. Think less courtroom drama and more dark dungeon whispers. Often, it was a very ad hoc affair, depending on who was doing the questioning, who was being questioned, and what kind of information was at stake. A king interrogating a suspected traitor would likely have very different methods than a village constable trying to figure out who stole a loaf of bread. Let's start with the milder side. Relatively speaking, psychological manipulation was a key tool. Remember, many people were deeply religious, so playing on their fears of divine judgment was common. Interrogators might suggest that confessing would cleanse their soul, or that continued denial would damn them for eternity. It's about exploiting existing beliefs to create internal pressure. Isolation was another powerful tactic. Imagine being locked away in a dark cell, completely cut off from the world. No human contact, no idea what time it is, no sense of how long you've been there. This sensory deprivation could break down even the strongest wills. The goal was to make the person feel utterly alone and vulnerable, desperate for any kind of connection, even if it meant confessing. Then there was sleep deprivation. Keeping someone awake for days on end, constantly questioning them, could lead to disorientation, confusion, and eventually, a willingness to say anything just to get some rest. It's a classic technique, and it was definitely employed back then. But let's be honest, a lot of medieval interrogation went far beyond psychological tricks. Physical torture was a common, and often accepted, part of the process. Again, the specific methods varied, but the goal was always the same: inflict enough pain to break the person's resistance. One of the most common methods was the rack. The victim's limbs were tied to rollers at either end of a wooden frame, and then slowly, excruciatingly, stretched. Dislocation of joints was common, and in extreme cases, limbs could be torn completely from their sockets. Think of it as a slow, agonizing stretching machine designed to maximize pain. Another favorite was the strappado. The victim's hands were tied behind their back, and then they were hoisted into the air by a rope attached to their wrists. Often weights were added to their feet to increase the strain. This could dislocate shoulders, elbows, and wrists, and cause immense pain. The sudden drop was often incorporated to cause an even greater shock. Waterboarding, or something very similar, was also used. The victim was strapped down, and water was poured over their face, simulating the sensation of drowning. It's a terrifying experience and can quickly induce panic and a willingness to confess to anything. And let's not forget the good old thumbscrews. These devices slowly crushed the thumbs or sometimes other fingers between two metal plates. The pain was intense and debilitating and could easily lead to permanent damage. Simple but effective. The Judas cradle was another delightful invention. The victim was suspended over a sharp pyramidal point and then slowly lowered onto it. The pressure on the anus, genitals, or coccyx was agonizing, and prolonged exposure could cause severe internal injuries. I am telling you, this really was not a fun time. Now you might be thinking, surely there were some limits to this torture, right? Well, sometimes, but often it depended on the interrogator's temperament and the perceived severity of the crime. Some interrogators were sadists who enjoyed inflicting pain, while others were simply trying to get the job done as quickly as possible. It was a very subjective and often brutal process. Importantly, the use of torture was often justified by the belief that it was necessary to uncover the truth. The idea was that an innocent person would be able to withstand the pain, while a guilty person would eventually break down and confess. Of course, this is complete nonsense. Anyone, regardless of their guilt or innocence, will eventually break under enough torture. Also, the confessions obtained through torture were notoriously unreliable. People would say anything to make the pain stop, even if it meant confessing to crimes they didn't commit. This led to many wrongful convictions and executions, and also makes it very difficult for historians to determine the truth in many medieval cases. Because think about it, they are saying things to stop the pain and not the truth. And it wasn't just physical pain. Humiliation and psychological torment were also used to break down the victim's spirit. They might be stripped naked, publicly shamed, or forced to endure mock executions. The goal was to destroy their sense of self-worth and dignity, making them more willing to cooperate. It's about attacking their identity. Finally, let's talk about the role of evidence. In many medieval interrogations, evidence was secondary to confession. If you confessed, you were guilty, regardless of whether there was any other proof. This created a system where the focus was on extracting a confession rather than on actually investigating the crime. It really makes you think about it. The interrogation methods of the Middle Ages were brutal, unreliable, and often based on flawed logic, but they were also a reflection of the harsh realities of the time, where information was power, and the pursuit of truth often took a back seat to the demands of security and control. It is an interesting, if very, very dark aspect of our history, and sometimes the darkness is important to remember as well. All right, let's gently ease into the rather complicated world of information gathering in the Middle Ages. Forget James Bond gadgets and satellites. We're talking about a time when reliable information was rarer than a clean pair of socks. So how did medieval rulers, merchants, and even the church sift through the mountains of whispers, rumors, and outright lies to get to something resembling the truth? Well, it was a messy, imperfect process, but surprisingly sophisticated given the constraints. Imagine a world without newspapers, radio, or the internet. Information traveled slowly, primarily by word of mouth. This meant that its accuracy was often questionable. You might hear about a battle weeks after it happened, with each telling adding a new layer of exaggeration or outright fabrication. Knowing how a rumor can start in a group of friends, imagine that over a whole kingdom. One of the most common sources of information was simply, well, people. Travelers, merchants, pilgrims, anyone who moved from place to place carried news, gossip, and observations. Kings and nobles officials would often encourage these individuals to share what they had seen and heard, offering rewards or simply a warm meal and a place to sleep. Of course, not all information was created equal. A seasoned merchant who had spent years trading in a particular region would likely have a more accurate understanding of local conditions than a wide-eyed pilgrim on their first journey. So discerning the reliability of your sources was absolutely crucial, and that's where the art of medieval intelligence gathering really came into play. Rulers often had networks of informants, people who were strategically placed to gather information and report back. These informants could be found in all walks of life: courtiers, servants, tavern keepers, even members of rival factions. It was a complex web of loyalties and betrayals, where everyone had their price. Think of it like this: a king might have a trusted advisor at court who quietly listened to gossip and reported back anything of interest. He might also have a contact in a neighboring kingdom's court, providing inside information on their plans and intentions. These networks extended far and wide and were almost impossible to fully untangle. Courtly life itself was a rich source of intelligence. Observing the relationships between nobles, their alliances, their rivalries, all this could provide valuable clues about the political landscape. Who was whispering to whom? Who seemed to be out of favor? Who was receiving secret messages? These were the kinds of questions that a skilled observer would be constantly asking. Beyond human sources, rulers also relied on written documents, letters, treaties, legal records. These could provide insights into the intentions and capabilities of other rulers and kingdoms. However, reading between the lines was often necessary. Diplomatic language could be deliberately vague or misleading, and treaties were often broken as soon as it suited one party's interests. Another important source of information was the church. With its vast network of monasteries and clergy, the church had eyes and ears in every corner of Christendom. Monks were often highly literate and well-traveled, making them ideal observers and reporters. The Vatican itself was a major center of intelligence gathering, with its own secret archives and network of informants. But getting information was only half the battle. The next challenge was to verify its accuracy. This often involved cross-referencing information from multiple sources and looking for patterns or inconsistencies. Did multiple travelers report the same troop movements? Did a letter confirm a rumor circulating at court? The more corroborating evidence you had, the more confident you could be in the reliability of the information. Of course, even with the best efforts, mistakes were inevitable. Sometimes rulers acted on false information with disastrous consequences. A misjudged alliance, a poorly timed attack, all could result from faulty intelligence. But that's the nature of espionage. It's a high-stakes game where the risks are always present. Now, comparing this whole process to modern intelligence gathering is kind of amusing. We have satellites, electronic surveillance, and sophisticated data analysis. Medieval rulers had to rely on their wits, their networks of informants, and a healthy dose of skepticism. But in their own way, they were masters of the art of espionage, navigating a complex and dangerous world with limited resources. I hope you are just as comfortable navigating sleep right now. Alright, settle in, because even in the land of bravado and grit, things didn't always go according to plan. We're talking about medieval spies, and let's face it, these weren't James Bond types with all the gadgets. More often, they were just ordinary folks, maybe a bit too ambitious, or maybe just plain unlucky. And when they got caught, well, the consequences could be unpleasant. Now, one thing to remember is that medieval justice wasn't exactly known for its subtlety. Forget Miranda rights, or even a fair trial. If you were suspected of espionage, especially against a powerful ruler, your fate was pretty much sealed. We're talking torture, imprisonment, and executions that were often public spectacles designed to deter others. Think of it like this: kings and queens wanted to send a very clear message. Disloyalty, especially the kind that could compromise their power, simply wouldn't be tolerated. So, the penalties were often deliberately gruesome. Let's start with a common scenario: the intercepted message. Imagine a spy painstakingly copying down troop movements or court secrets, carefully encrypting the message if they even knew how, and entrusting it to a seemingly reliable courier. But what if that courier got drunk in a tavern and bragged about their important mission? Or maybe they were just unlucky enough to be stopped by the enemy's patrol. If the message was discovered, it was game over. The courier would be tortured to reveal the source, and the spy would be hunted down. And the punishment? Well, that depended on the ruler's temperament, but common options included hanging, drawing, and quartering. That's where well, it's best not to go into too much detail, beheading or even being burned at the stake. Nasty stuff. But it wasn't just about intercepted messages. Sometimes a spy's cover would be blown in other ways. Maybe they got too greedy, trying to line their own pockets while working for their master. Or perhaps they became too friendly with the locals, raising suspicions among their handlers. One particularly risky move was falling in love. Imagine a spy infiltrating a rival court, charming their way into the inner circle, and then falling head over heels for the enemy's daughter. Talk about a conflict of interest. Even if they weren't discovered, the emotional turmoil alone could be enough to derail their mission. And if they were found out, the consequences would be even more severe for everyone involved. Think Romeo and Juliet, but with added torture and political intrigue. Another common mistake was simply underestimating the enemy's intelligence. Medieval rulers weren't dummies. They knew that espionage was a fact of life, and they often had their own counterintelligence networks in place to sniff out spies. These counter-spies might pose as ordinary citizens, tavern owners, or even fellow spies, all the while keeping an eye out for suspicious activity. One famous example involves Edward I of England. He was known for his ruthless efficiency and his dedication to crushing rebellions. He supposedly had a network of informants throughout Scotland, and he wasn't afraid to use brutal tactics to maintain control. So if you were a Scottish spy trying to stir up trouble in England, you had to be very careful. And let's not forget about good old-fashioned betrayal. Spies, by their very nature, are often untrustworthy individuals. They're willing to lie, cheat, and deceive for their masters, so it's not surprising that they might also be willing to betray their colleagues, or even their employers, for a better reward. A rival spy might reveal your identity to gain favor, or a disgruntled handler might sell you out to the enemy. The consequences of betrayal were, again, brutal. But they also had a personal element. Being betrayed by someone you trusted, someone you'd worked alongside, had to be a particularly devastating experience. Then there's the honey trap. This involved using attractive women, or sometimes men, to seduce information out of targets. It was a risky tactic, but when it worked, it could be incredibly effective. However, if the target discovered the deception, the spy's life was worth less than dirt, and the honey used in the trap was very likely to be punished just as harshly. Of course, not all espionage failures resulted in death. Sometimes a spy would simply be imprisoned. This could be a fate worse than death, especially in the dark, damp dungeons of the medieval era. Imagine spending years, maybe even decades, in solitary confinement with little food, no sunlight, and no human contact. Your mind would slowly unravel, and you'd eventually lose all hope. And even if a spy managed to escape capture, their career was usually over. They'd be branded as a traitor, hunted by both sides, and forced to live in the shadows, constantly looking over their shoulder. It was a lonely and dangerous existence. So as you can see, the life of a medieval spy wasn't all glamour and intrigue. It was a dangerous game with incredibly high stakes. And when things went wrong, the consequences could be absolutely horrific. It really makes you appreciate the relatively safe and comfortable world we live in today, doesn't it? Alright, settle in, because tonight we're going to gently nudge aside a few dusty old stereotypes and shine a light on the often overlooked contributions of women in the shadowy world of medieval espionage. You see, history, particularly when it comes to spying, tends to paint women in rather limited roles. Think damsels in distress, used as bait, or perhaps seductive figures, leveraging their charm to extract secrets. And while yes, those roles did exist, they represent only a tiny fraction of the real story. The truth is, women were far more actively involved, and often far more crucial than the history books might lead you to believe. Their involvement spanned a whole spectrum of roles, from message carriers and code breakers to skilled observers, and even, yes, sometimes, skilled assassins. And often, their very position in society, seemingly powerless, was actually their greatest strength. Consider this: in a world dominated by men, women were often underestimated. They were seen as less threatening, less likely to be involved in political intrigue, and therefore less likely to be scrutinized. This afforded them a level of access and freedom of movement that men simply didn't have. Think about courtly life. Women, especially those of noble birth, were integral to the social fabric of the court. They attended gatherings, moved freely between chambers, and engaged in seemingly innocuous conversations. But behind that facade of polite society lay a network of information gathering, where a keen eye and a subtle ear could glean valuable intelligence. A woman, seemingly just gossiping with her ladies-in-waiting, could be quietly assessing the mood of the court, listening for rumors of discontent, or observing the interactions between key figures. She could then relay that information to her husband, her brother, or even directly to the king or queen, providing a vital insight into the political landscape. Their gossip was anything but. It was a carefully cultivated source of information. Moreover, women often managed households and estates. This gave them access to vast networks of servants, tenants, and suppliers. These individuals, in turn, could provide a steady stream of information about local affairs, troop movements, and economic conditions. The lady of the manor, seemingly preoccupied with managing her household, was actually at the center of a web of intelligence gathering. And let's not forget the crucial role women played in communication. In an era before reliable postal services, messages often had to be carried by hand. Women, considered less likely to be targeted or suspected, were often entrusted with this vital task. They could travel disguised as pilgrims, merchants, or even wandering entertainers, carrying coded messages or secret documents hidden in their clothing or belongings. Their ability to blend in, to appear unassuming, was their greatest asset. Take, for instance, the example of messengers. It's easy to overlook the courage and resourcefulness it took to undertake such a mission. Imagine traversing dangerous roads, facing bandits and hostile forces, all while protecting your precious cargo. The risk of capture and torture was very real, yet many women willingly undertook these missions, driven by loyalty, conviction, or simply the desire for adventure. Then there's the fascinating realm of code breaking. While ciphers and codes were primarily developed and used by men, women were often involved in deciphering them. Their keen minds and attention to detail made them ideally suited for this intricate work. Hidden away in secluded chambers, they would pore over encrypted messages, searching for patterns and clues that could unlock their secrets. Without their efforts, many important messages would have remained unread, potentially altering the course of history. Beyond these more traditional roles, some women even engaged in more direct forms of espionage. Disguise was a common tactic, allowing them to infiltrate enemy camps or gather information undetected. They might dress as men, joining military units, or working as laborers, blending in with their surroundings and observing the enemy's movements. Or they might adopt other disguises, such as fortune tellers, traveling merchants, or even religious figures, using their assumed identities to gain access to restricted areas and gather intelligence. There are recorded stories of women working as assassins. While less common than other roles, it's a stark reminder that women were capable of great courage and ruthlessness when the situation demanded it. These women often operated alone, relying on their wits and skills to carry out their missions. Importantly, we must also remember that many of these women were acting not out of choice, but from necessity. In a world where their options were limited, espionage offered a means of gaining power, influence, or simply survival. For some, it was a way to protect their families, their communities, or their beliefs. For others, it was a chance to prove their worth in a society that often undervalued them. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, let's rewrite that mental image of the medieval spy. Let's move beyond the damsel in distress and the seductive temptress, and instead envision a more complete picture: resourceful women using their wit, their skills, and their unique position in society to play a vital role in the shadowy world of espionage. Remember the silent message carrier, the sharp-eyed observer at court, the clever code breaker, and the brave woman disguised in enemy territory. They are all part of the hidden history, whispered through the ages, of women spies of the medieval era. Good night. All right, let's settle in and drift off into how spying actually influenced international relations back in medieval times. I know, sounds like it could be a college lecture, but trust me, we'll make it nice and sleepy. So imagine a world with way less Amazon Prime and infinitely more, well, suspicion. Kings weren't just worried about conquering the next kingdom over, they were paranoid about being overthrown from within, or double-crossed at the negotiating table. This is where espionage stepped in, not just as a cool side hustle for assassins, but as a crucial tool for diplomacy. Think of it as the medieval version of reading someone's texts before a big meeting. Now, diplomacy in the Middle Ages wasn't all fancy banquets and signing treaties. It was a constant dance of power, where knowing the other side's secrets gave you a serious leg up. Ambassadors, these fancy envoys sent to foreign courts, weren't just there to exchange pleasantries. They were often tasked with gathering intel, kinda like human data miners. They'd befriend nobles, listen to court gossip, and generally try to figure out what the ruler was really planning. I picture them as these quiet observers, always with one ear open, sipping wine and pretending to be interested in tapestries, while secretly piecing together clues about troop movements or alliances. And it wasn't just about knowing military secrets either. Spies could uncover weaknesses in a kingdom's economy, like a bad harvest or a corrupt tax system. This information could be used to pressure a rival into making concessions, or even to justify a war if things really escalated. It's a bit like finding out your neighbor is struggling financially before you try to buy their house. But with armies, the information gathered by spies also helped shape alliances. If a king knew that two of his rivals were secretly plotting against each other, he could use that knowledge to his advantage. Maybe he could play them off each other, offering support to one in exchange for their loyalty. These were delicate maneuvers, where one wrong step could lead to war, so good intelligence was absolutely key. Let's picture a specific scenario. King Alfred of, let's say, England, is worried about King Bertram of rival Kingdom Bertland. Bertram is building up his army, but says it's just for show, just regular exercises. Alfred sends a spy, a clever chap named Cecil, into Bertram's court. Cecil, under the guise of a wandering minstrel, so cliché, right, manages to befriend one of Bertram's top generals after a rousing song about taxes. Over several weeks, fueled by plenty of mulled wine, Cecil learns that Bertram isn't planning an attack on England. Instead, Bertram wants to invade a smaller territory that England has a treaty to protect. Okay, Alfred now knows that Bertram will be really vulnerable if England is provoked and is ready. England is safe, for now. Of course, sometimes spying backfired spectacularly. Imagine a spy getting caught red-handed, trying to bribe a guard, or being exposed by a double agent. That could lead to a diplomatic crisis, or even war. There's this fascinating story about, I'm blanking on the kingdom right now, but their spy network was so aggressive and obvious that it actually damaged their relationships with other countries. Nobody wanted to be friends with the kingdom that was constantly snooping on them. It's like the medieval version of getting blocked on all social media. What's fascinating is how this cat-and-mouse game of espionage influenced the very nature of diplomacy. Rulers became more cautious about who they trusted, and ambassadors had to be extra careful about what they said. This created a climate of suspicion and intrigue, where alliances could shift in an instant, and secrets were the most valuable currency. It's like the world's most complicated poker game, where everyone is bluffing and trying to read each other's tells. This constant need for intelligence also led to some creative solutions. For example, some kingdoms used coded messages to communicate with their spies, which we'll get into later because it's fascinating. Others relied on trusted messengers who memorized important information, acting as human hard drives. And of course, there were the classic methods of disguise and deception, with spies pretending to be merchants, monks, or even waitresses. A lot of that cloak and dagger kind of stuff we talked about. But all this sneaky behavior wasn't just about winning wars or gaining territory. It also helped to maintain peace. By knowing what their rivals were planning, rulers could avoid misunderstandings that might have led to conflict. Good intelligence could also help to de-escalate tensions by revealing that a perceived threat was actually a misunderstanding. So in a weird way, spies were actually contributing to stability, even though they were operating in the shadows. Overall, espionage played a massive role in shaping international relations in the Middle Ages. It wasn't just a side activity for assassins and tricksters, it was a necessary instrument of diplomacy, helping rulers navigate the treacherous landscape of medieval politics. Knowing someone's secrets gave you power, and that power could be used to win wars, forge alliances, or even maintain peace. So next time you read a story about medieval knights and castles, remember that there was a whole hidden world of spies and secrets operating beneath the surface, subtly influencing the course of history. It's also very James Bond, but with less martinis and more mead. Sweet dreams. Alright, settle in a bit deeper, friends. Now we get to the juicy part, the names you might actually recognize. We're diving into the stories of famous medieval spies. Though famous might be a bit of a stretch. Remember, good spies are unfamous. But history has left us tantalizing glimpses of a few figures who dabbled, or rather, mastered the art of deception. First up, let's whisper the name of Sir Francis Walsingham. Ah yes, this Elizabethan spy master wasn't strictly medieval. I know, but his methods, honed in the late 16th century, were direct descendants of medieval techniques. Think of him as the culmination of centuries of espionage evolution. Walsingham, Queen Elizabeth I's principal secretary, built a vast and intricate network of informants that spanned across England and the continent. He sniffed out plots against the Queen, including the infamous Babington plot, which led to the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. His success? Ruthless efficiency, a bottomless purse. Thanks, Queenie, and a genuine belief that the security of England rested on his shoulders. Now, Walsingham employed a vast network, and many names are lost to the mists of time. But, and this is exciting, we do know snippets. Imagine double agents infiltrating Catholic seminaries, deciphering coded letters hidden in beer barrels, and planting false information to mislead enemy powers. It's Shakespearean drama, unfolding in the shadows, all thanks to Walsingham's persuasiveness. Then there's Gilles de Rais. Now this one's a bit darker. He was a 15th century French nobleman, a companion in arms of Joan of Arc, and a serial killer. Yeah, not exactly the resume you'd expect for a master spy, but hear me out. Gilles de Rais possessed all the qualities of a brilliant intelligence operative gone horribly wrong. Charisma? Check. Wealth? Double check. An understanding of human psychology and the ability to manipulate others? Sadly, a resounding check. He used his power and influence to shield his depraved activities, creating a curtain of secrecy around his crimes that took years to penetrate. While not a spy in the traditional sense, Gilles de Rais demonstrates how intelligence, cunning, and access can be weaponized to conceal even the most monstrous deeds. A chilling reminder that the skills of espionage can be used for both good and evil. Now let's look at Eleanor of Aquitaine. While not known as just a spy, Eleanor wielded power and political insight that would put most modern intel agencies to shame. This woman was a medieval powerhouse, queen of both France and England, not at the same time, mind you. Divorce got in the way, and mother to kings. She was a shrewd negotiator, a master of courtly intrigue, and crucially, incredibly well informed. How did she do it? Well, she had ears everywhere. Her extensive network of contacts, from royal courts to religious orders, provided her with a constant stream of intelligence. She knew what the kings knew, and often more. Eleanor used this knowledge to protect her interests, to influence political decisions, and let's be honest, to generally run rings around the men in her life. She understood the power of information, and she wielded it with the skill of a seasoned spy. She also fostered a whole family of intelligence leaders. Her son Richard the Lionheart learned the value of information, and that information could change the course of battles. Let's think about the lesser-known but incredibly valuable members of the intel community. Imagine the unassuming monk, Brother Thomas, quietly observing conversations in the monastery scriptorium, overhearing whispered secrets that could destabilize a kingdom. Picture the traveling merchant, Isabella, discreetly gathering information about troop movements and trade routes as she barters for silks and spices. Or the Queen's chambermaid, Agnes, passing along information overheard from the royal court. Think about that traveling merchant a bit more. Merchants were by their very nature wanderers. They crossed borders, spoke multiple languages, and had access to a wide range of people. This made them ideal candidates for espionage. A merchant could easily gather intelligence about enemy troop movements, economic conditions, and political intrigues, all while appearing to be simply conducting business. Their trade networks served as ready-made communication channels, allowing them to transmit information quickly and discreetly across vast distances. The best part, their activities were already considered part of trade, so they would be able to travel and talk without arousing suspicion, all while conducting business as usual. They would essentially be hiding in plain sight. These everyday individuals were the unsung heroes of medieval espionage. They risked their lives for king, country, or simply for the thrill of the game. Their stories may not be as grand as those of kings and queens, but they are just as vital to understanding the hidden world of medieval spies. They would gather the little bits of information that, taken together, would amount to something meaningful and worthy of action. They were the unsung and largely uncredited backbone of it all. Finally, let's mention Richard de Clare, 2nd Earl of Pembroke. This 12th first-century nobleman, also known as Strongbow, was a key figure in the Norman invasion of Ireland. Now, he wasn't just a conqueror, he was also a master of intelligence gathering. Before launching his invasion, Strongbow sent agents to Ireland to assess the political landscape, to identify potential allies, and to gather information about the strength and weaknesses of the Irish kingdoms. He used this intelligence to plan his invasion, to exploit existing rivalries, and to secure his victory. Strongbow's success in Ireland demonstrates the importance of intelligence in military campaigns, and how even the most powerful armies can benefit from a little bit of strategic insight asterisk. So there you have it, a glimpse into the shadowy world of famous, or at least notorious medieval spies. These were just a few examples of the individuals who operated in the shadows, shaping the course of history through their cunning, their deception, and their unwavering dedication to their craft. We know that the vast majority of spies worked in the shadows, and the mists of time have carried most of them away, unacknowledged and unheralded. But hopefully, this peek will help you grasp how espionage worked in the medieval world. Alright, settle in folks, because tonight we're venturing into the intriguing world of medieval spies as portrayed in literature. It's easy to get swept away by tales of daring knights and cunning assassins, but how much of what we read is actually true? Let's gently peel back the layers of fact and fiction, comparing the thrilling narratives with the often messier reality found in historical accounts. Now, medieval literature, chronicles, romances, ballads, and even religious texts, they all give us glimpses of spies and spying. But keep in mind, these weren't documentaries. Authors often embellished stories to entertain, to make a political point, or simply because they didn't have all the facts. Think of it like this: a modern-day action movie. Sure, it might be inspired by real events, but it's probably got way more explosions than actually happened, right? One of the biggest differences between literary spies and historical spies is the motivations we see. In stories, spies are frequently driven by love, revenge, or a sense of patriotic duty. Sir Lancelot might infiltrate a rival court to rescue Queen Guinevere, or a loyal servant might uncover a plot to assassinate the king. While these motivations did exist, historical accounts paint a more complex picture. Power, wealth, and personal gain were just as, if not more, common drivers for espionage. Medieval rulers were notorious for bribing informants, promising land or titles in exchange for valuable information. So the literary spy is a purely noble figure, probably a bit of a stretch. Then there's the methods they used. In literature, spying often involves elaborate disguises, secret passages, and coded messages hidden in plain sight. We imagine shadowy figures lurking in the corners of castles, eavesdropping on conversations and leaving cryptic notes under doors. And while some of that certainly did happen, the reality of medieval espionage was often much more mundane. A lot of it relied on simple observation, rumor-mongering, and exploiting existing social networks. Think merchants gossiping in taverns, servants overhearing conversations in the kitchens, or religious pilgrims carrying information from one place to another. It wasn't always about James Bond-esque gadgets or Mission Impossible-style infiltration. Another key area where literature and reality diverge is the effectiveness of spies. In stories, spies are often incredibly successful, uncovering crucial information that changes the course of events. They prevent wars, expose traitors, and save kingdoms from certain doom. In reality, well, spying was a lot less reliable. Information was often incomplete, inaccurate, or simply misinterpreted. A single piece of bad intel could lead to disastrous decisions, and many espionage attempts ended in failure, with spies being caught, tortured, or executed. So while literature portrays spies as almost superhumanly effective, historical accounts remind us that they were just as fallible as anyone else. And of course, we can't forget the drama. Literary spies are often involved in high-stakes situations, facing constant danger and living on the edge. They're skilled fighters, masters of disguise, and quick thinkers who can outwit their enemies at every turn. But the truth is, most medieval spies probably led fairly unremarkable lives. They were ordinary people who happened to be in the right place at the right time, or who had a particular skill for gathering information. They weren't always dashing heroes or femme fatales, they were often just people. It's also important to consider who wrote these stories. Most medieval literature was produced by members of the aristocracy or the clergy, who had their own biases and agendas. They might have exaggerated the role of spies to glorify the power of the monarchy or to demonize their enemies. Or they might have simply been repeating popular myths and legends without necessarily knowing the full truth. So when we read about spies in medieval literature, we need to take it with a grain of salt and consider the source. Now, that's not to say that medieval literature is completely devoid of historical accuracy. Some stories are based on real events, and they can provide valuable insights into the social and political climate of the time. For example, chronicles like Froissart's Chronicles or the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle offer accounts of events that have some grounding in the real world, but it's still important to approach them with a critical eye, comparing them with other sources and looking for evidence of bias or exaggeration. Ultimately, the portrayal of spies in medieval literature is a blend of fact and fiction. It reflects both the realities of espionage in the Middle Ages and the creative imagination of the authors who wrote about it. By comparing these literary depictions with historical accounts, we can get a more nuanced understanding of what spying was really like. A world of intrigue, deception and danger, but also one of mundane tasks, unreliable information, and ordinary people caught up in extraordinary circumstances. So next time you read a thrilling tale of medieval espionage, remember to ask yourself how much of this is true and how much is simply a good story. And with that, we drift a bit further off to sleep. Sweet dreams. Alright, settle in, because we're about to peek into the medieval spy's toolbox. Forget James Bond gadgets, these were the low-tech, but surprisingly effective, implements that helped agents operate in a world of castles, conspiracies, and constant danger. Ready for some historical snooping? First up, let's talk about the king of clandestine communication, invisible ink. Now, the concept itself isn't particularly medieval, but the refinement and widespread use of it really took off during this period. Think about it. No internet, no encrypted emails, just handwritten letters carried by messengers who could be intercepted at any moment. Invisible ink was a must. The recipes weren't exactly scientific masterpieces, more like kitchen chemistry experiments. A common concoction involved milk, vinegar, or even fruit juice. Applied to parchment with a quill or a sharpened stick, these liquids would dry clear, leaving no visible trace. The message would only reappear when heated. Gently holding the paper over a candle flame or near a warm fire would reveal the secret words as they darkened. A bit risky, of course, too much heat and you'd just have a charred mess, but effective when done right. Another popular method used urine. Yes, really, the ammonia in urine, when heated, would oxidize and darken, revealing the hidden message. It sounds crude, but hey, it was readily available and virtually undetectable until revealed. A slightly more sophisticated and less smelly version involved using a solution of metallic salts, like iron sulfate. This would react with a developing agent, like gallic acid, to reveal a message in dark ink. This was a more reliable method and created a darker, more readable image. The key to effective invisible ink wasn't just the recipe, but also the technique. Spies had to practice their handwriting, learn to control the amount of liquid they used, and find ways to disguise the invisible message within an otherwise innocent letter. Think of it as hiding in plain sight, a shopping list for the queen, with vital information subtly inserted between requests for new tapestries and extra swans. Speaking of hiding in plain sight, let's move on to concealed compartments. Imagine you're a courier tasked with delivering sensitive documents. Simply carrying them openly would be, well, a recipe for disaster. So spies and messengers relied on cleverly hidden compartments to safeguard their secrets. Think of hollowed-out books, where pages were carefully cut away to create a space for documents or small objects. These fake books could blend seamlessly into a scholar's library or even a traveling merchant's pack. Other popular hiding places included the heels of boots, the lining of hats, and even specially designed belts with secret pouches. Personal items were another great opportunity for concealment. Rings with hidden compartments were a favorite. These could hold tiny scrolls with coded messages, or even a small dose of poison for emergencies, or perhaps eliminating a threat. Rosaries and prayer beads could be strung with hollow beads that held miniature messages. Even musical instruments weren't immune. Flutes and lutes could be modified to conceal documents within their bodies. The level of craftsmanship sometimes needed was truly impressive. Some skilled artisans specialized in creating these hidden compartments, crafting intricate mechanisms that were both secure and undetectable. These compartments were often secured by false bottoms or by twisting components that needed to be aligned in the right order. And remember, no power tools. Everything was crafted by hand. Beyond these physical tools, medieval spies also relied heavily on their skills of observation and deception. Disguises were a crucial part of their repertoire. A spy might need to blend in with a crowd of peasants or infiltrate a noble's court, so mastering the art of disguise was essential. This wasn't just about throwing on a different set of clothes, it was about adopting a new persona. A spy might study the local dialect, learn the customs and manners of a particular region, and even alter their appearance to match the role they were playing. Think of a spy trying to pass as a commoner, but having hands that were clearly used to wearing a sword. Disguise went beyond wearing the clothes of someone in a trade and involved knowing their work, their tools, and their vocabulary. Sometimes, a simple change of hairstyle or facial hair could be enough to fool casual observers. Other times, more drastic measures were needed. Wigs, false beards, and even makeup were used to alter a spy's appearance. And of course, a convincing backstory was essential. A spy had to be able to answer questions about their origins, their family, and their occupation without raising suspicion. The best disguise was one where no one even thought to question your presence. Another critical tool in the medieval spy's arsenal was the cipher. In a world without computers, encrypting messages required ingenuity and careful planning. Simple substitution ciphers, where each letter was replaced with another letter or symbol, were common. For example, every A could be replaced with a could, every bird with a D, and so on. But these simple ciphers were easily broken. A skilled codebreaker could often decipher a message by analyzing the frequency of different letters, so more sophisticated methods were needed. One popular technique was the use of codebooks, which contained lists of words or phrases, each assigned a unique code number. A spy would use the codebook to encrypt their message, and the recipient would use the same codebook to decrypt it. Codebooks were relatively secure, but they had one major weakness. If the codebook fell into the wrong hands, all the messages encrypted with it would be compromised. So spies had to be extremely careful to protect their codebooks, and they often used multiple codebooks for different types of messages. Another clever technique was steganography, which involved hiding the existence of the message itself. Think of a seemingly innocent poem where the first letter of each line spells out a secret message, or a musical score where certain notes indicate code letters or numbers. Steganography was a way to communicate without anyone even realizing that a message was being sent. And finally, let's not forget the most important tool of all, a sharp mind. Medieval spies had to be intelligent, resourceful, and adaptable. They had to be able to think on their feet, make quick decisions, and stay calm under pressure. They had to be skilled observers, able to notice subtle details that others would miss, and they had to be masters of deception, able to lie convincingly and manipulate others to get what they wanted, all without the help of the internet or social media. In a way, the medieval spy was a highly skilled, low-tech version of a modern intelligence agent. And that's just fascinating, isn't it? Alright, let's gently navigate the sometimes treacherous waters of medieval counter-espionage. Because if everyone's spying, then someone has to be stopping them, right? It's like a historical game of cat and mouse, except the stakes were usually way higher than a missed nap. Think of it this way, building a castle is great. Big walls, impressive towers, lovely stained glass windows if you're feeling fancy. But what good is a castle if the enemy knows exactly where your secret passage leads, or that the baker's boy is actually reporting your troop movements back to their king? Not very good, right? That's where counter-espionage comes in. It's all about defense, deception, and keeping your secrets, well, secret. One of the most basic yet effective methods of counter-espionage was simply good old-fashioned security. Sounds boring, I know, but bear with me. This meant controlling access to sensitive information and areas. Royal courts, for example, were notoriously leaky places, so kings and queens would rely on trusted advisors, people they hopefully knew they could depend on to keep their mouths shut. These advisors would act as gatekeepers, controlling who had access to the royal ear, and therefore royal secrets. Then there's the ever-popular method of diversion and disinformation. If you can't completely stop the flow of information, you can at least try to muddy the waters. Spreading false rumors, leaking misleading documents, and generally creating a confusing landscape of information could make it difficult for enemy spies to get their hands on the real goods. It's like playing a game of telephone but with world-altering consequences. Think of it like this: a rival kingdom is trying to figure out your plans for the upcoming harvest, so you accidentally let slip a rumor that you're planning to focus on growing wheat. Meanwhile, your actual plan is to cultivate barley, which is far more resilient to the predicted drought. The enemy spies dutifully report this false information back home, and their kingdom makes all the wrong preparations, while you reap a bountiful harvest of barley. Sneaky, right? Another crucial aspect of medieval counter-espionage was surveillance. Keeping a close eye on potential spies, both foreign and domestic, was essential. This meant employing informants, patrolling borders, and generally being vigilant about suspicious activity. Tavern keepers were often valuable sources of information, as they had a front-row seat to the comings and goings of travelers and locals alike. Plus, people tend to loosen their tongues after a few tankards of ale. But surveillance wasn't just about watching outsiders. Sometimes the biggest threats came from within. That's why medieval rulers often employed methods of internal security. This could involve monitoring the activities of their own courtiers, nobles, and even family members. It might sound paranoid, but power struggles and betrayals were common occurrences in the medieval world, so a little bit of suspicion was often a healthy thing. Of course, no discussion of counter-espionage would be complete without mentioning code breaking. If your enemies are using secret codes to communicate, then breaking those codes is a high priority. Medieval code breakers weren't exactly using supercomputers, but they were surprisingly adept at deciphering messages using various techniques, including frequency analysis and educated guesses. It was a painstaking process, but the rewards could be immense. Now, what happens when you actually catch a spy? Well, that depends. In some cases, the spy might simply be quietly expelled from the kingdom, with a stern warning not to return. In other cases, the punishment could be far more severe. Imprisonment, torture, and execution were all potential fates for captured spies, depending on the severity of their crimes and the mood of the ruler. Remember, medieval justice wasn't always known for its gentle touch. Let's not forget the use of double agents. Turning an enemy spy into your own asset was a clever way to both gain valuable information and spread disinformation. A double agent could feed false intelligence back to their original handlers, while also providing you with insights into the enemy's operations. It's a risky game, but the potential payoffs could be huge. Medieval counter-espionage wasn't a glamorous profession. It involved a lot of tedious work, careful observation, and difficult decisions. But it was a crucial aspect of medieval life, helping to protect kingdoms, maintain power, and keep secrets safe in a world where trust was a rare commodity. So, next time you're struggling to keep a secret, just remember the medieval spies and counter-spies, and maybe you'll find some inspiration, or at least a good story to help you drift off to sleep. Alright, let's settle in and ponder something a bit heavier tonight. Something that isn't always black and white. We're drifting into the murkier corners of medieval espionage, the ethics, morality, all those lovely grey areas. Now, when we think of spies, even the medieval ones, a certain glamour, perhaps, attaches itself. We imagine daring disguises, whispered secrets in candlelit rooms, and the satisfaction of a mission accomplished, right? But beneath all that, there's a whole host of moral questions bubbling away like a witch's brew. In our modern world, we have, well, some semblance of rules, however often they're bent or broken. International laws, codes of conduct, Geneva Conventions, but in the medieval era, things were different. It was a world governed largely by personal oaths, feudal loyalties, and religious doctrine, all swirling around in a potent cocktail of political maneuvering. So, where did espionage fit into this picture? Was it simply a necessary evil, a tool to be used by kings and popes alike, irrespective of moral considerations? Or were there lines that even the most ruthless rulers wouldn't cross? Let's face it, the act of spying itself involves deception. You're inherently misleading someone, gaining their trust under false pretenses to extract information. And in a society where honor and trustworthiness were so highly valued, at least publicly, This was a pretty big deal. Think about the knightly code of chivalry, for example. Loyalty, honesty, courage, all fine and dandy on the battlefield. But did those principles extend to the shadowy world of intelligence gathering? Probably not always, no. For a king, the rationale was usually straightforward: the security of the realm. If knowing what your enemies were planning could prevent a war, save lives, or secure vital resources, then arguably, the ends justified the means. Machiavelli, writing a little later, would certainly have agreed. The prince must do what is necessary to maintain power, even if it means acting immorally. It's all about the state, you see, but what about the individual spy? What moral compass guided them? Well, often it was necessity. Many spies were simply trying to survive. Perhaps they were coerced into service, threatened with imprisonment or death if they refused to cooperate. Or maybe they were motivated by financial gain, a chance to escape poverty and provide for their families. In these cases, the moral dilemma becomes incredibly complex. Ossels amuse and telv, wath and tesm. Is it justifiable to betray a friend or country to save your own skin? Then there's the question of who gets spied on. Was it morally acceptable to target innocent civilians, to spread misinformation that could incite violence or unrest? What about using spies to assassinate political opponents? These were all very real possibilities in the medieval world, and the answers weren't always clear-cut. The church, as you might imagine, had its own unique perspective on all of this. On one hand, they condemned lying and deceit. Remember the commandments, thou shalt not bear false witness. But on the other hand, they also believed in protecting the faithful and rooting out heresy. So, if spying could help them identify and eliminate threats to the church, was it then a justifiable act of holy warfare? Many church leaders seemed to think so, rationalizing their actions as necessary for the greater good. And then we have the ever-present problem of false flags, planting fake evidence, impersonating officials to stir up trouble. These techniques were used plenty. Again, it's all about justification. If you could reasonably argue that these actions saved lives, or kept the peace, or upheld God's law, then who was to say it was wrong? And if it was wrong, who was going to do anything about it? One thing to consider is the concept of honor. It's very easy, centuries later, to dismiss it as ridiculous, but it was important. Some people, even in the murky world of medieval espionage, would still adhere to certain principles. Maybe they would refuse to spy on close friends. Maybe they would refuse to carry out assassinations. Maybe they would only target those they considered to be enemies of the realm. But even with these personal codes, the potential for abuse was enormous. The line between justifiable espionage and outright treachery could easily become blurred, especially in the heat of political conflict. And let's not forget the ever-present temptation of power. Once someone gains access to secret information, they can use it for their own personal gain, manipulating events to their advantage, regardless of the consequences. Ultimately, the ethics of espionage in the medieval era were as complex and multifaceted as the society itself. There were no easy answers, no universally accepted rules. It was a world where moral considerations were often weighed against political expediency, where individual conscience clashed with the demands of loyalty, and where the pursuit of knowledge could lead down a very dark path indeed. And that makes for a pretty fascinating, if somewhat unsettling, thing to think about as we drift off to sleep. Alright, let's drift into the shadowy world of medieval espionage during times of war, shall we? It's a fascinating, often overlooked aspect of medieval history. Think about it. Battles weren't always won by brute force alone. Secret knowledge, whispered betrayals, and well-placed misinformation could be just as decisive, maybe even more so. Imagine two armies facing each other across a muddy field. One side has more soldiers, stronger armor, maybe even better weapons. But the other side knows something they don't. They know the enemy commander is arrogant and predictable. They know about that unguarded mountain pass. They know the enemy's supply lines are stretched thin and vulnerable. That knowledge is power. And in the medieval world, acquiring that power often meant relying on spies. See, warfare wasn't just about charging headlong into the fray. It was a complex game of strategy, logistics, and crucially, intelligence. Knowing your enemy, their strengths, their weaknesses, their plans, could mean the difference between victory and utter annihilation. Espionage could give you that edge. A well-placed spy could infiltrate the enemy camp, learn about troop movements, discover hidden defenses, and even sabotage their supplies, all of which could dramatically shift the balance of power on the battlefield. Think of the Battle of Crécy in 1346, during the 100 Years' War. The English army, significantly outnumbered by the French, achieved a stunning victory. While English longbowmen certainly played a crucial role, some historians suggest that English intelligence gathering may have also contributed to their success. Perhaps they knew the terrain better, or maybe they were aware of discord among the French commanders. Or take the example of sieges. Sieges were a common feature of medieval warfare. Starving out a castle's defenders was often a more effective tactic than trying to storm its walls. But sieges could be long and costly. So what if you could shorten the process? A spy inside the castle could sabotage the defenses, open a gate from within, or even poison the water supply. Suddenly that seemingly impenetrable fortress becomes much more vulnerable. And it wasn't just about military information either. Economic intelligence was also vital. Knowing the state of your enemy's treasury, the availability of resources, and the stability of their trade routes could inform your strategic decisions. For example, if you knew your enemy was struggling financially, you might be able to force them into a disadvantageous peace treaty. Or if you knew their vital trade routes were vulnerable to attack, you could disrupt their economy and weaken their ability to wage war. Think about the wool trade in medieval England. Wool was a major source of revenue for the English crown. Knowing which ports and merchants were involved and how to disrupt that trade could give a rival power a significant advantage. But espionage in warfare wasn't always about grand schemes and strategic victories. Sometimes it was about the little things that could make a big difference. A well-placed bribe could convince a guard to look the other way. A whispered rumor could sow discord among the enemy ranks. A cleverly disguised message could mislead the enemy about your intentions. These seemingly minor acts of deception could have a ripple effect, ultimately influencing the outcome of a battle or a campaign. And it wasn't just about winning battles either. Espionage could also be used to prevent them. A timely warning about an impending attack could allow you to reinforce your defenses and deter the enemy from launching an assault. Or if you knew that a potential alliance was being formed against you, you could use spies to sow seeds of distrust and prevent the alliance from solidifying. In this way, espionage could be a powerful tool for maintaining peace, or at least preventing open warfare. But of course, relying on spies was a risky business. Spies could be unreliable, double-crossers, or simply incompetent. And if a spy was caught, the consequences could be dire: torture, imprisonment, or a gruesome execution. So using spies was a gamble, but one that medieval rulers were often willing to take. The potential rewards, victory in battle, economic advantage, or the prevention of war, were simply too great to ignore. And while we often think of armies and battles as being very masculine spaces, women often played a crucial role in espionage. They could move more freely than men, blend more easily into different social settings, and use their perceived innocence to their advantage. Imagine a woman posing as a traveling merchant, gathering information about enemy troop movements, or a lady-in-waiting, eavesdropping on conversations in the royal court, or even a seemingly harmless peasant woman, carrying messages hidden in her clothing. These women were often unsung heroes of medieval warfare, risking their lives to gather vital intelligence. So next time you're reading about a medieval battle, remember that it wasn't just about knights in shining armor and clashing swords. Behind the scenes, a silent war was being waged, a war of spies, secrets, and deception. And that war could be just as decisive as any battle fought on the field. Alright, settle in, because we're about to drift through how the sometimes sneaky, sometimes brutal methods of those medieval spies actually seeped into modern espionage. It's kind of wild when you think about it. So forget James Bond for a second, and let's rewind. While we might not have medieval spies rappelling down castles with laser gadgets, or did they? The principles they used, those are surprisingly persistent. Think about tradecraft. Medieval spies, operating in a world of limited communication, had to be masters of disguise, deception, and information gathering. A lot of that is just common sense, right? But they really formalized it. Think about a merchant, maybe traveling from Venice to Constantinople. He's not just buying and selling spices, he's observing troop movements, listening to rumors about political intrigue, maybe even subtly bribing officials for intel. He's a walking intelligence operation. Today, that translates directly into the use of covers in espionage. An intelligence officer might pose as a diplomat, a journalist, or even a researcher. The purpose is the same: to gain access to information and move around without raising suspicion. It's about creating a believable persona that allows you to blend in. Medieval spies understood the value of that implicitly. Then there's the art of encryption. We talked about codes and ciphers, right? Well, while modern encryption is, quantum computer resistant and all that jazz, the basic need for secure communication is unchanged. The medievals used substitution ciphers, simple code words, hidden messages within seemingly innocent letters. Today, we use algorithms and complex key systems, but the goal remains the same: to protect sensitive information from prying eyes. Those early attempts at cryptography, however rudimentary, laid the foundation for the sophisticated systems we rely on today to keep information away from bad actors. Think about how often your email may or may not be getting read by outside parties. Let's drift into counterintelligence. Medieval rulers weren't just spying on their enemies, they were also trying to protect their own secrets. This involved things like, carefully vetting those entering their service, making sure the people handling sensitive information were loyal. Today, counterintelligence is a huge field, involving everything from background checks to surveillance of suspected double agents. That medieval paranoia about traitors in the court? That's still very much alive today, only the stakes are a lot higher. Now, I know what you're thinking. Modern espionage has drones, satellites, and hacking. What can medieval spying possibly contribute? And that's fair, but it's not about the technology, it's about the mindset, the human element. The medievals were masters of human intelligence, or humant, as it's called today. They understood people. They knew how to exploit vulnerabilities, how to manipulate emotions, how to build trust or the illusion of trust to get what they wanted. Those skills are timeless. In fact, in an age of increasing technological sophistication, humant is becoming more important, not less. You can hack into a computer, but you can't hack into a person's mind. You can gather all the data in the world, but you still need human analysts to interpret it, to understand the context, to identify the real threats. That medieval emphasis on understanding human behavior, that's more relevant than ever. And consider the ethics of espionage. Okay, ethics might be a strong word. Medieval spying was often a brutal, ruthless business. But even then, there were unspoken rules. There was a sense that certain things were unacceptable. Poisoning, for example, was often seen as particularly dishonorable, even in a world where assassination was commonplace. Modern espionage operates in a similar gray area. There are laws and treaties that govern what intelligence agencies can and cannot do, but the moral boundaries are often blurry. What's permissible in the name of national security? How far is too far? These are questions that have plagued spies and rulers for centuries. Medieval spies were operating in a world before the Geneva Convention. They were figuring out those boundaries. One of the biggest impacts to modern spying were their methods of psychological warfare. In an era before mass media, spreading disinformation was a subtle art. Medieval rulers used rumors, propaganda, and carefully crafted narratives to undermine their enemies and sway public opinion. Today, we see this playing out on a global scale with disinformation campaigns on social media. The techniques are different, but the goal is the same: to influence people's perceptions and behaviors. Even something as simple as creating plausible stories is something we see in all levels of espionage. Spies need to have a cover story that makes sense, something that can be used to explain their presence and their actions. Medieval spies had to do the same thing. Maybe they were merchants buying and selling goods. Perhaps they were traveling musicians moving through the lands. They needed to come up with a cover story that was believable to the people around them. Those methods are what inspired current-day infiltration techniques. So while the tools and technology of espionage have evolved dramatically since the Middle Ages, the core principles remain surprisingly consistent: disguise, deception, encryption, counterintelligence, human intelligence, and the ethical dilemmas. These are all themes that echo through the centuries. And the next time you see a spy movie, remember that those sleek gadgets and high-tech gizmos are just the modern equivalent of a hidden message in a wax tablet or a coded symbol on a merchant's ledger. The game is the same, just the pieces have changed. All right, let's settle in and drift into a possible day in the life of a medieval spy. It might not be what you expect. Less James Bond, more, well, let's just see, shall we? Imagine waking up before dawn, no alarm clock, just the rooster and the chill seeping through the drafty walls of your, well, let's call it a safe house. It's certainly not luxurious. Think rough-hewn timbers, a straw-filled mattress that's seen better centuries, and the ever-present aroma of wood smoke and something vaguely unpleasant. Your clothes are simple, unremarkable. Brown or grey wool, perhaps a tunic and hose. Nothing that would draw attention. Remember, blending in is key. Today, you're posing as a traveling merchant, or maybe a humble scribe. Your persona shifts with the mission, a chameleon adapting to its surroundings. Breakfast is meager, a hunk of coarse bread, maybe some watered-down ale. Fuel for the day's work, but hardly a feast. You check your meager belongings, a pouch with a few coins, enough to maintain the charade, a small writing kit, if you're playing the scribe, and crucially, your tools. Hidden compartments in your belt or boot might conceal a small knife, a lockpick, or a vial of invisible ink. Your primary weapon, though, is your mind. Sharp observation skills, a keen memory, and the ability to weave a convincing story are far more valuable than any blade. The morning is spent gathering information. Perhaps you're loitering in the town square, listening to gossip and rumors. A chance encounter with a talkative guard at the castle gates could yield valuable insights into troop movements. A seemingly innocent conversation with a local innkeeper might reveal secrets about visiting dignitaries. Remember, nothing is wasted. Every overheard snippet, every facial expression, every detail of the environment is carefully noted and stored away. You're looking for patterns, inconsistencies, anything that deviates from the norm. The medieval world was a world of whispers. Information traveled slowly, often distorted by rumor and exaggeration. Your job is to sift through the noise and find the signal. Later you might visit the local market, ostensibly to purchase goods, but your real aim is to observe the flow of commerce, the arrival of new merchants, and the goods they're trading. Are there any unusual shipments, any signs of contraband? You might strike up a conversation with a fellow merchant, feigning interest in their wares. A well-placed question, a subtle probe, could reveal their allegiances and motivations. The afternoon might involve more direct infiltration. If your target is a nobleman's estate, you might attempt to gain entry as a servant or a craftsman. Perhaps you're a skilled carpenter, offering your services to repair a broken gate, or a wandering minstrel, hoping to entertain the court. Once inside, you're constantly observing, listening, and recording. You might spend hours studying the layout of the castle, noting the location of key rooms, guard posts, and escape routes. You might attempt to eavesdrop on conversations, concealing yourself behind tapestries or in darkened corridors. The risks are immense. Discovery could mean imprisonment, torture, or even death. You must be constantly vigilant, aware of your surroundings, and ready to improvise. As dusk approaches, you seek a safe place to record your findings. This might be a secluded corner of the forest, or a hidden room in your safe house. You use your invisible ink to write your report on a scrap of parchment, carefully encoding the message to protect it from prying eyes. Perhaps you use a simple cipher, replacing letters with numbers or symbols, or a more complex system, based on a pre-arranged keyword or phrase. The possibilities are limited only by your ingenuity. Once the message is complete, you must find a way to deliver it to your contact. This might involve entrusting it to a carrier pigeon, hiding it in a hollowed-out book, or burying it in a secret location. The delivery is often the most dangerous part of the mission. You must be discreet, avoiding detection by enemy agents or suspicious authorities. A wrong move could expose your entire operation. The evening is spent lying low, avoiding attention. You might visit a tavern, blending in with the local clientele, but you remain alert, always scanning the room for potential threats. Your meal is simple, unappetizing, perhaps a bowl of stew or some stale bread and cheese. You eat quickly, anxious to return to your safe house. Before sleep, you review your notes, reinforcing the details in your mind. You also prepare for the possibility of a sudden escape, a pre-packed bag with essential supplies, hidden near the door, a secret passage if you're lucky. Sleep comes fitfully, punctuated by nightmares and anxieties. The medieval world was a dangerous place, and a spy's life was particularly precarious. The cycle begins anew with the next dawn, another day of deception, intrigue, and constant risk. A life lived in the shadows, where trust is a luxury and betrayal is always a possibility. It's a lonely life, a stressful life, but it's a life of purpose, perhaps of service, maybe of greed, but it's never ever a dull one. And now, sleep. Let the world drift away. All right, settle in everyone, because now we're at a really interesting part, I think. We're going to take a peek at how medieval espionage stacks up against modern spying. You might be surprised at just how much has changed, but also maybe a little surprised at how much hasn't. First, let's talk about technology. Obvious, right? I mean, in the Middle Ages, the pinnacle of communication technology was like a well-trained pigeon. And now we've got satellites, encrypted emails, facial recognition software. It's a whole different ballgame. Medieval spies relied on things like invisible ink, which, let's be honest, was probably more slightly fainter ink than actually invisible. They used ciphers, which were often pretty simple substitution codes that a clever scholar could crack with a bit of time. Think Caesar ciphers, where you just shift each letter a few places down the alphabet. Effective for a bit, but not exactly quantum encryption. Modern spies, they're dealing with AI, sophisticated hacking tools, and the constant threat of cyber warfare. It's a digital battlefield out there. The speed and scale of information gathering are just on a completely different level. In the Middle Ages, gathering intelligence was painstaking. It involved months of travel, cultivating sources, slowly piecing together rumors and whispers. Now a single analyst can sift through terabytes of data in a matter of hours. It's like comparing a horse-drawn cart to a rocket ship. Both can get you from point A to point B, but, well, you get the idea. But, and this is a big but, while technology has transformed the how of spying, the why and the what are surprisingly consistent. The core motivations remain the same: power, security, and control. Kings wanted to know what their rivals were plotting, just like nations want to know what other nations are doing today. The desire to gain an advantage, to anticipate threats, to manipulate events, that's all timeless. And what about the what? What kind of information were they after? In the Middle Ages, it might have been details about troop movements, fortifications, or the health of a rival king. Today, it might be about nuclear capabilities, economic stability, or emerging technologies. The subjects change, but the underlying need for information that provides an edge remains the same. Think about it. Knowing the enemy's weaknesses has always been valuable. Now, let's talk about the human element. This is where things get really interesting. While technology has changed dramatically, the human skills required for espionage have evolved, but not fundamentally changed. A good spy, whether medieval or modern, needs to be persuasive, observant, and able to build trust. They need to be good at reading people, detecting deception, and adapting to different situations. Medieval spies relied heavily on disguise and deception. They might pose as merchants, traveling minstrels, or even religious pilgrims to gain access to enemy territory. They had to blend in, to be unremarkable, to be the kind of person that people wouldn't suspect of anything. It was all about cultivating relationships, gaining people's confidence, and subtly extracting information. Modern spies still use disguise and deception, of course, but the stakes are higher. They might be working undercover for years, infiltrating terrorist organizations or foreign governments. The psychological pressure is immense, and the consequences of failure are far greater. Think about the risks of being caught in a foreign country, accused of espionage in today's world. But the core skills, that ability to adapt, to blend, to persuade, that's all still essential. The ethics of espionage is another area where we see both change and continuity. In the Middle Ages, spying was often seen as a morally grey area. It was considered necessary for survival, but also somewhat dishonourable. Kings might employ spies, but they wouldn't necessarily brag about it. Modern espionage is still ethically complex. Governments engage in activities that would be considered illegal in other contexts, all in the name of national security. The debate about the balance between security and privacy, the justification for surveillance, the morality of targeted killings, these are all contemporary echoes of the ethical dilemmas that medieval rulers faced. One big difference, though, is accountability. In the Middle Ages, a king could basically do whatever he wanted, with little oversight. Modern intelligence agencies are, at least in theory, subject to some form of legal and political oversight. There are parliamentary committees, judicial reviews, and public scrutiny. Of course, the extent to which these mechanisms are truly effective is always a matter of debate. Finally, consider the role of information warfare. In the Middle Ages, propaganda was relatively crude. Think town criers spreading rumors or ballads that glorified a particular king. It was effective but limited in scope. Today, we're dealing with sophisticated disinformation campaigns, social media manipulation, and the weaponization of fake news. The ability to influence public opinion, to sow discord, to undermine trust in institutions. This is a powerful tool in the modern spy's arsenal, and it's a reminder that the battle for information isn't just about gathering secrets, it's also about controlling the narrative. So when we compare medieval and modern espionage, we see a fascinating mix of continuity and change. Technology has transformed the tools and techniques, but the underlying motivations, the core human skills, and the ethical dilemmas remain surprisingly consistent. It's a reminder that espionage, at its heart, is a human endeavor. It's about power, deception, and the never-ending quest for information. And that's something that hasn't changed much at all over the centuries. Okay, time for a little rest. You earned it. And so we arrive at the end, a little bleary-eyed, hopefully a little more enlightened, and perhaps just a touch more ready for a nap. We've journeyed through the shadowed alleys and sun-drenched courts of the medieval world, peeking behind tapestries and eavesdropping on whispered conversations. We've uncovered a world of spies, not the glamorous, gadget-laden figures of modern cinema, but resourceful, often desperate, individuals operating in a world of constant peril. But what is it about this hidden history that continues to fascinate us, centuries later? Why do we still find ourselves drawn to the world of medieval spies? I think part of the answer lies in the sheer intrigue of it all. In a world so vastly different from our own, yet so fundamentally similar in its human dramas, the idea of secrets and hidden agendas holds a powerful allure. The lack of technology, ironically, makes the espionage all the more compelling. There are no satellites, no surveillance cameras, no digital trails to follow. Instead, we have to rely on the ingenuity of human beings, their ability to observe, to deceive, to blend in, or to stand out just enough to be noticed. It's a human chess game played with real lives as the pieces. Think about the dedication required. Years spent cultivating a false identity, mastering a foreign language, enduring hardship and isolation, all for the sake of delivering a single crucial piece of information. These weren't weekend warriors or keyboard commandos. These were individuals who committed their entire beings to the art of espionage, often at immense personal risk. Their stories, however fragmented or incomplete, offer a glimpse into a world of unwavering dedication and breathtaking courage, or perhaps, depending on your perspective, terrifying ruthlessness. Another aspect of the enduring allure, I believe, is the inherent drama of espionage. The stakes are always high. The consequences of failure are often dire. The medieval world, with its constant power struggles, its religious conflicts, its dynastic ambitions, provided the perfect stage for these high-stakes dramas to unfold. A single piece of intercepted correspondence, a whispered confession, a betrayal in the night, could alter the course of history. The knowledge that these events actually happened, that real people lived and died by their wits and their secrets, adds a layer of gravitas that fictional spy stories often lack. We're not just watching a performance, we're witnessing a slice of a very secretive past. Furthermore, the medieval world, despite its differences, offers a mirror to our own. We see in these historical spies echoes of the same human motivations that drive espionage today: the pursuit of power, the protection of national interests, the desire for revenge, the simple need to survive. The methods may have changed, from carrier pigeons to encrypted emails, but the underlying human impulses remain remarkably consistent. This connection to our own world, this recognition of shared human motivations, makes the study of medieval espionage more than just an academic exercise. It's a way of understanding ourselves, our societies, and the enduring human fascination with secrets and deception. It's all a matter of perspective, and let's not forget the moral ambiguity. Espionage, by its very nature, exists in a grey area. Spies lie, they deceive, they manipulate, they sometimes even kill. In the medieval world, where the lines between right and wrong were often blurred by religious dogma and political expediency, these moral dilemmas were even more pronounced. Was it justifiable to betray a friend for the sake of your king? Was it permissible to use torture to extract information from an enemy? Was it morally acceptable to assassinate a political rival, even if it meant preventing a war? These are questions that plagued the medieval world, and they continue to haunt us today. By studying the ethical complexities of medieval espionage, we can gain a deeper understanding of the moral challenges that face intelligence agencies and policymakers in our own time. How far is too far in the pursuit of information, and who gets to decide? Beyond all of that, there's a pure, almost childlike wonder that I find myself experiencing when I read about this. Medieval spies are, in essence, masters of disguise. They're the original social engineers. They were able to infiltrate enemy territory and gather information, or manipulate key individuals, all without the aid of modern technology. Imagine the planning, the attention to detail, the sheer nerve required to pull off some of these operations. It's like watching a magician perform a seemingly impossible feat, and wondering, how did they do that? And the answer, more often than not, lies in a combination of intelligence, resourcefulness, and sheer audacity. The medieval world was also a world of secrets. In a time when literacy was rare, when communication was slow and unreliable, when information was power, The ability to keep a secret, to guard a confidence, was a highly valued skill. Spies were in essence the custodians of these secrets, entrusted with information that could make or break kingdoms. This sense of exclusivity, of being privy to knowledge that was hidden from the masses, adds another layer to the allure of medieval espionage. It's like being given a backstage pass to a historical drama, a glimpse behind the curtain of power. And finally, perhaps the most enduring aspect of the allure of medieval spies is the reminder that history is not just about kings and queens, battles and treaties. It's also about the ordinary people who lived and worked in the shadows, whose actions, however small or seemingly insignificant, helped to shape the course of events. The medieval spy, whether a lowly peasant gathering rumors in a tavern, or a high-ranking cleric manipulating papal policy, represents the human element in history, the individual agency that can influence even the grandest of narratives. They remind us that history is not just something that happens to us, but something that we make through our choices, our actions, and our secrets. So as we drift off into the land of Nod, let's carry with us not just the facts and figures of medieval espionage, but also the sense of wonder, the intrigue, the drama, and the moral complexity that make this hidden world so endlessly fascinating. And let's remember the quiet, often unacknowledged individuals who worked in the shadows, whose stories, however fragmented, offer a glimpse into the human condition at its most resourceful, most daring, and perhaps most desperate. Sleep tight, and don't let the bedbugs spy on you. You never know who might be listening.